This is Jay Carper, and I'm continuing a conversation on a Sabbath to Yahweh. This is the third video in part 4, When is the Sabbath? In the previous two videos, I addressed the answers that the Sabbath is Jesus, or any day of the week, as well as the possible answer that the Sabbath has moved from the seventh day of the week to the first day, what we call Sunday. In this video, I'm going to talk about an idea that you might not have heard of before. This video is going to be a little bit more technical because I'm going to have to explain to you what this idea really is and what it means before I can tell you whether or not it answers the question, when is the Sabbath? Anyone can say anything on the internet. It really is the Wild West of information. If there is some idea out there about some way that we could do anything, somebody is on the internet arguing for it, no matter how outlandish it might seem. Let me read to you from Leviticus 23, verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to Yahweh in all your dwelling places. We work 6 days and we rest on the seventh day. This seems pretty straightforward. So what is really the question about when is the Sabbath day? Many ancient peoples arranged their calendar into weeks by dividing the lunar month into quarters according to the phases of the moon. You've heard of the phrase, the Ides of March. The Ides is the center of the month. It's when the moon is full, or at least it was when Rome still kept a lunar calendar. Rome, Babylon, Persia, all of these peoples at one time calculated their years according to the phases of the moon. At the new moon, a new month started. The full moon is the middle of the month, and then as the moon wanes, the month ends. The lunar Sabbath idea proposes that this is the way that God intended us to form our weeks, not just our months, so that a week is determined by the phases of the moon. The first week of the month begins at the new moon. The second week begins when the moon is half full. The third week begins when the moon is full. And the fourth week begins as the moon is waning when it's again half full. The most popular method of counting the days according to the lunar Sabbath makes the day of the new moon a Sabbath day. And then the 8th day, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the month are the weekly Sabbaths. Two common reasons for calculating weeks this way is that first, many ancient cultures really did do this, and second, some of God's appointed times, days of rest, fall on the 15th and the 22nd of the month. For example, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the first day of Sukkot will always fall on the 15th day of the months of Nisan and Tishrei, respectively. And the 8th day of Sukkot, which is also a day of rest, always falls on the 22nd day of Tishrei. However, there are a couple of problems with this idea. First, God doesn't necessarily do things the way that other nations do it. Just because the Babylonians or the Persians or the Egyptians did something, doesn't mean that the Hebrews did it or that God wanted anybody to do it that way. The second problem is that the only days called Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible are the weekly Sabbath and Yom Kippur. God's annual feast days included days of rest, but these aren't called Sabbath except for Yom Kippur. The last day of unleavened bread, the holiday of Shavuot, also called Pentecost, and Yom Kippur just don't fit the lunar Sabbath pattern. These days of rest will never fall on the 1st, 8th, 15th, or 22nd, or 29th days of the month. There are 3 words or phrases used to describe rest days in God's various appointed times. For some of them, God says there will be no servile work on those days. Others are called Shabbat, Shabbaton, and still others are called Shabbaton. The King James Version translates this word Shabbaton as Sabbath unless it's used together with the Hebrew word Shabbat, as in Shabbat, Shabbaton. Then it translates it as rest. However, this is not the best way to translate the word Shabbaton. The words Shabbat and Shabbaton are related, but they're not the same word. The English Standard Version always translates Shabbaton as rest and never as Sabbath. So when the scriptures say that a day is a Shabbaton, the English Standard Version says this is a day of solemn rest. If the Hebrew calls the day a Shabbat Shabbaton, the English Standard Version calls it a Sabbath of rest. What's on your screen right now is a list of times for which God commanded rest. These highlighted days are annual days of rest. They only come around once each year. Note that these aren't all of God's appointed times. I have not included Passover Day nor the Day of Early First Fruits because those aren't commanded rest days. I have only included appointed times for which God commanded rest. With the lunar Sabbath, 4 out of 7 of the high holy days would fall on a weekly Sabbath. The first day of unleavened bread, Yom Teruah, or the Day of Blowing Trumpets, also known as Rosh Hashanah, the first day of Sukkot, also known as the Feast of Tabernacles, and the 8th day of Sukkot. However, 3 of the annual Moedim will never correspond to the lunar Sabbath day. The 7th day of unleavened bread on the 21st of Nisan, the day of Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. This day always falls one day after the weekly Sabbath, and so by definition can never be on the Sabbath. And finally, Yom Kippur, which is always on the 10th day of the month of Tishrei, and so by the lunar Sabbath calculations, will never fall on a weekly Sabbath. Notice that none of the annual days of rest that would fall on a day of the lunar Sabbath are called Shabbat in the Bible. They're either called Shabbaton or they're called a day on which you will do no servile work. None of them are called Shabbat. But I think the real proof positive, or maybe I should say the proof negative, lies with the day of Shavuot. This is Leviticus 23, 15, and 16, and I've arranged it this way in bullet points so that you can see a literary structure that is very common in the Bible. It's called a parallelism. In a parallelism, the same statement is made twice, first one way and then another way in order to emphasize or clarify the point that's being made. You shall count 7 Sabbaths from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to YHWH. This day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering is the day after the Sabbath during Passover week. Sometimes it's called the early first fruits. The grain offering presented in the second half is the day of Shavuot, sometimes called the latter first fruits. The first half of this parallelism says that Shavuot, or Pentecost, is 7 full weeks from the day after the weekly Sabbath during Passover week. The second half of the parallelism says that Shavuot is the 50th day after the weekly Sabbath of Passover. The Hebrew in the first part says 7 Sabbaths. The Greek Septuagint says 7 full weeks. Strangely, the English Standard Version follows the Greek in verse 15 and the Hebrew in verse 16. That's why I put Sabbaths in brackets in verse 15. I'm going with the Hebrew in both cases because I think consistency makes it make more sense. These verses are saying the same thing in 2 different ways to make sure there's no misunderstanding. 50 days equals 1 day plus 7 weeks. They're the exact same thing, just described using different terms. Since a lunar cycle is always more than 28 days, technically a lunar month is 29.5 days approximately, these numbers will never work with the lunar Sabbath. Rather, a continuous weekly cycle of 7-day weeks is the only count that works with the biblical commands about Shavuot. Let me show you in more detail so you know exactly what I mean. Every year, the day that the Passover lamb is slaughtered is on the 14th of Nisan, and the 15th day of Nisan is a day of rest. On the lunar Sabbath, the 15th of every month is a weekly Sabbath day. According to the commands for Shavuot, the count of 50 begins the day after the 15th of Nisan, which we call the early first fruits, and you can see that on the top left of this calendar. In this image, I'm counting Rosh Chodesh, which is Hebrew for the beginning of the month, as a weekly Sabbath. And if that's the proper way to count the Sabbaths, then after Nisan 15, there are 8 Sabbath days before you get to the 50th day. Since the command says to count 1 day plus 7 Sabbaths, clearly that won't work. In this image, the orange square represents the 7th Sabbath. And then the 50th day, or Shavuot, comes 7 days after that, not the very next day as the Bible says. But what if Rosh Chodesh is counted as a special day of rest and not as a weekly Sabbath? Well, let's take a look at that count. As you can see, Passover is on Nisan 14, and then Nisan 15th is the first day of unleavened bread, a commanded day of rest. On the lunar Sabbath calendar, that makes it also a weekly Sabbath. The count to Shavuot begins the very next day on the early first fruits. But then Nisan 22nd is the first Sabbath after Nisan 15th. If Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, is not counted as a weekly Sabbath, you only have 6 weekly Sabbaths before you get to the 50th day. But the command for Shavuot says that the 50th day will be 1 day after the 7th Sabbath. So once again, the lunar Sabbath doesn't match the command in Scripture. The only way to make the lunar Sabbath work with the Shavuot count is to interpret 7 Sabbaths as 7 sets of 7 days, but that in itself refutes the whole idea of the lunar Sabbath. There is no count of 7 days except within the lunar cycles. Neither the Greek nor the Hebrew says 7 sets of 7 days. It's either Sabbaths or weeks, neither one of which will ever add up to 50 days in any lunar Sabbath method of counting. The counting of 50 days from the Passover Sabbath to Shavuot only works in a continuous cycle of 7-day weeks, with no interruptions and no connection to the phases of the moon. So then we're back to the Sabbath on the 7th day. I think a much more important question is, how did Yeshua do it? Let me read to you from Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 24. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus had many confrontations about the Sabbath with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, but every confrontation he had was about how to keep the Sabbath, not when. Jesus always kept the Sabbath on the same day that the Pharisees did. So, is there some way that we can find out for sure what day the Pharisees and the Sadducees kept the Sabbath? Actually, yes, there is. This is a quote from a Roman historian about the Roman attack in Jerusalem in 36 BC. Cassius Dio was a contemporary of Jesus. He lived in both BC and AD, so he would know how the Romans kept their calendar. He was also a historian specifically talking about Rome's wars with the Jews. So he probably had a pretty good idea of how the Jews lived too. Cassius Dio wrote, "The first of the Jews to be captured were those who were fighting for the precinct of their God, that is, Jerusalem. And then they rest on the day even then called the day of Saturn." Here's another quote from a Roman historian. Frontinus is writing about the sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD by General Titus. The deified Augustus Vespasian attacked the Jews on the day of Saturn, a day on which it is sinful for them to do any business. So here are 2 Roman historians saying that the Jews kept their Sabbath on the same day that the Romans called the day of Saturn. The Roman week was originally an 8-day week. They also had a competing 10-day week, but it was not tied to the lunar cycles by this time, and Rome actually began widespread adoption of the 7-day week at about 45 BC. Rome learned the 7-day week from the Babylonians and Persians, other peoples that they had wars with and conquered. There were many converts in the Roman Empire to Babylonian religions, and they brought their 7-day week with them. And the Romans found that this scheme worked so well they wanted to do it themselves. So Rome converted to a 7-day week long before the birth of Jesus. Roman historians, both BC and AD, identified the Jewish Sabbath with the Roman Saturn's Day. And then Jewish historians, for example, Philo and Josephus, confirmed this correlation. So we know for a fact that in the 1st century, the Jews and the Romans had the same week, and the Jewish Sabbath was on Saturn's Day and was totally unconnected to the lunar cycle. So if Jesus kept the Sabbath on the same day that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all of the Jews of the Roman Empire did, Jesus did not keep a lunar Sabbath. If Jesus is the Messiah, then he was sinless. He never violated one of God's commandments. And that includes the weekly Sabbath. Above all, God said, "You will keep my Sabbath." In fact, by the 4th century, Jews, Christians, pagans all across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East all used the same 7-day week. There have been numerous calendar changes throughout the centuries, but all of those changes only applied to the dates. For example, the names of the months and the number of the years. Those calendar changes after 45 BC never changed the days of the week. Since so many people from so many different countries, even mortal enemies, were all keeping the same week, if Rome changed the order of their days of the week, it would cause mass chaos all over the world. Nobody else would agree to change their calendar just to match Rome. Persians and Arabs and Vikings didn't change their years to match Rome's years. Not until they were conquered much, much later. And even then, many of those people never changed their years to match Rome's. So why would they change something like the days of the week that would cause so much more chaos in the daily lives of everyday people? Such a change would make enormous waves in historical documents. And it's just not there. The order of the days of the week have not changed since 45 BC. They have not changed since Jesus walked the earth and used that calendar. So we know that the days of the week that we keep today are the exact same days that Jesus did. And we know that he did it right. So the 7th day today is still the 7th day of creation. This is Jay Carper from AmericanTorah.com and CommonSenseBibleStudy.com. Join me in one more video as I wrap up this discussion of a Sabbath to Yahweh.